On the morning of January 5th, 1943 at 08:15 hours, Lieutenant Raymond "Red" Cochran stood behind the 5-inch gun mount aboard the USS Helena, watching 8 Japanese Val dive bombers pull out of their attack runs and turn for home. The humid air above Guadalcanal carried the distant drone of Wright Cyclone engines as the enemy aircraft climbed through scattered clouds at 4,000 feet, confident they had struck their targets and would make it back to their base at Munda unharmed. Cochran was 32 years old, a gunnery officer who had spent the past 3 months training his crew on ammunition that wasn't supposed to exist. The shells loaded in his breech looked identical to standard anti-aircraft rounds, but hidden inside each projectile was a miniature radio transmitter smaller than a light bulb, packed with components so delicate that Navy ordnance officers had initially declared them impossible to manufacture. His gunner, Seaman First Class Eddie Ralston, checked the elevation one more time, tracking the lead bomber as it disappeared into a cloud bank 3 miles away. For months, Japanese aircraft had terrorized Allied naval forces across the Pacific with their speed and maneuverability. Dive bombers like the Val could change course in the seconds it took a conventional timed fuse to detonate, turning what should have been killing shots into harmless explosions of empty air. Every sailor in the Pacific had heard the statistics. Standard anti-aircraft fire required an average of 1,200 shells to down a single enemy aircraft. The math was brutal and simple. Japanese pilots who survived their first few missions became veterans who knew exactly how to evade the predictable bursts of timed fuses weaving through the sky while American gunners fired desperately at ghosts. The tactic had worked from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea, allowing Japanese aviators to press home their attacks despite intense defensive fire. Tonight, 8 Val bombers had just finished their assault on the cruiser formation, and their pilots believed they would join the hundreds of other Japanese airmen who had attacked American ships and lived to fly again. But Cochran's guns weren't loaded with the timed fuse rounds that every Japanese pilot had learned to evade. Instead, Ralston had chambered a Mark 32 proximity fuse projectile, a weapon so revolutionary that its very existence was classified at the highest levels of Allied intelligence. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. When that shell left the barrel, it would transmit radio waves that bounced off metal surfaces, and when those reflected signals reached a certain frequency, indicating the projectile had closed to within 70 feet of an aircraft, a miniature electronic circuit would detonate the warhead automatically. The Japanese pilots climbing away from Henderson Field had no idea they were about to meet a weapon that would transform their greatest advantage into their most fatal vulnerability. The first warnings of Japanese air activity came at 0700 hours on January 5th when radar operators at Henderson Field detected enemy aircraft forming up over New Georgia, approximately 90 miles northwest of the American cruiser formation. Lieutenant Cochran received the alert while his gun crew was conducting morning maintenance, cleaning the breech, and inspecting the loading mechanism for any signs of wear from the previous day's practice firing. The message was standard, but urgent. Enemy dive bombers, estimated at 8 aircraft approaching from the northwest, expected to reach the American position within 45 minutes. Admiral William Halsey had spent 2 weeks positioning his task force to intercept Japanese supply convoys, attempting to reinforce their garrison at Munda on New Georgia Island. His cruiser formation included 7 ships, the heavy cruisers Wichita, Louisville, and Chicago, plus 4 light cruisers, including Helena, all escorted by a screen of destroyers. The situation in the Solomon Islands had been desperate since the Marines landed on Guadalcanal 5 months earlier. Japanese air forces operating from bases throughout the Central Solomons could strike Allied positions with relative impunity, and conventional anti-aircraft defenses had proven inadequate to stop determined attack runs. Admiral Halsey knew that a successful defense against Japanese air power could change everything. If his cruisers could survive repeated air attacks while maintaining their patrol stations, American forces could interdict the Tokyo Express supply runs that kept Japanese garrisons fighting. But success required a dramatic improvement in anti-aircraft effectiveness. something that conventional weapons had failed to deliver. Despite 6 months of intense combat operations, the proximity fuse was not born from battlefield desperation alone. It was rooted in years of scientific research and industrial development that began in 1940, when British and American scientists recognized that conventional anti-aircraft fire was fundamentally inadequate against modern aircraft. Traditional timed fuses required gunners to estimate the range and future position of a target, set the fuse to detonate at that specific point, and hope the aircraft would still be there when the shell arrived seconds later. The margin for error was measured in fractions of a second and dozens of feet. An aircraft traveling at 300 miles per hour could move more than 400 feet in less than 1 second, easily evading a shell burst timed for its predicted position. Japanese pilots exploited this weakness by changing altitude and heading at irregular intervals, making their flight paths impossible to predict with the accuracy required for timed fuse. Effectiveness. Allied gunners found themselves firing at ghosts, expending enormous quantities of ammunition for minimal results. Dr. Merle Tuve at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory had been tasked with solving this problem in the summer of 1940. His Section T team faced challenges that seemed almost insurmountable. They needed to create a radar-like device small enough to fit inside a 5-inch artillery shell, rugged enough to survive the 20,000 G acceleration forces generated during firing, simple enough to be mass-produced by the millions, and reliable enough to function in combat conditions ranging from Arctic cold to tropical heat. The technical specifications seemed to violate basic laws of physics and engineering. A standard 5-inch shell measured 20 3/4 inches long and 5 inches in diameter, with most of that volume occupied by high-explosive propellant and a steel casing designed to create lethal fragments upon detonation. The proximity fuse had to fit into the nose cone, a space roughly the size of a coffee cup, and contain a complete radio transmitter, receiver, power supply, and detonation circuit. Every component had to function flawlessly after experiencing acceleration forces that would crush conventional electronics into fragments. The vacuum tubes required for the radio circuits were particularly problematic, since standard tubes would shatter instantly under the stress of gunfiring. Lieutenant Commander William Deke Parsons, who served as Section T's liaison to the Navy Bureau of Ordnance, understood the weapon's potential better than most. He had calculated that a proximity fuse could improve anti-aircraft effectiveness by a factor of 5 to 10, transforming air defense from a game of statistics and hope into a reliable means of protecting ships from attack. The improvement came from eliminating the prediction problem entirely. Instead of trying to estimate where an aircraft would be in the future, the proximity fuse detected where the aircraft actually was in the present, detonating at the optimal moment regardless of evasive maneuvers or changes in flight path. For maximum effectiveness against dive bombers and torpedo aircraft, Parsons preferred engagement ranges between 2,000 and 5,000 yards, where the fuse's 70-foot detonation radius would catch aircraft before they could release their weapons or take effective evasive action. The direct fire capability of 5-inch guns gave them significant advantages over larger caliber weapons when engaging visible targets. Unlike the massive 16-inch rifles on battleships that fired at ranges measured in miles, the 5-inch 38 caliber gun was designed for rapid fire against aircraft at ranges where optical directors could track targets accurately. The gun could fire 15 rounds per minute in the hands of a trained crew, with shells reaching targets at ranges up to 10 miles in less than 20 seconds. The weapon's relatively flat trajectory meant that shells traveled in nearly straight lines to targets at typical anti-aircraft ranges, simplifying fire control calculations and improving accuracy. Seaman Ralston had memorized the loading sequence until he could perform it in darkness or under the stress of combat. Each proximity fuse shell weighed exactly 54 pounds, requiring careful handling to avoid damaging the delicate electronics in the nose cone. The semi-automatic breech opened with a pneumatic hiss when fired, ejecting the spent powder case and allowing immediate insertion of the next round. Ralston could maintain a firing rate of 12 rounds per minute during sustained combat, though doctrine called for firing in salvos of 3 to 5 rounds to increase the probability of achieving a lethal proximity to the target. The ammunition supply presented logistical challenges that had concerned Lieutenant Cochrane since Helena received her first shipment of proximity-fused shells in late October 1942. Each gun mount maintained 50 rounds of standard ammunition and 25 rounds of the special proximity-fused projectiles, stored in temperature-controlled magazines deep within the ship's armored citadel. The proximity fuses were so secret that only officers with specific clearances were allowed to handle them, and sailors were forbidden from discussing their existence, even with crew members from other ships. The security was so tight that proximity-fused shells were officially designated as VT fuses for variable time, a deliberately misleading name intended to conceal their true function from enemy intelligence. Japanese naval intelligence had completely failed to identify the existence of proximity fuses in American defensive systems, focusing instead on conventional anti-aircraft guns and fighter combat air patrols that posed obvious threats to attacking aircraft. Enemy reconnaissance had observed American cruisers conducting gunnery practice in the waters south of Guadalcanal, but had not detected anything unusual about the anti-aircraft fire that might suggest a revolutionary new weapon system. Imperial Navy planners assumed that American ships would defend themselves with the same timed fuse ammunition that Japanese forces had been evading successfully since the beginning of the war. The gun crew had practiced their firing drill dozens of times during the weeks following Helena's arrival at Noumea in New Caledonia, working to achieve the split-second timing that would be essential when multiple enemy aircraft attacked simultaneously. Cochrane served as director officer, responsible for selecting targets and coordinating fire with other gun mounts, while Ralston loaded ammunition and maintained communication with the shell deck below. 2 additional sailors served as ammunition handlers, positioned in a ready room adjacent to the gun mount where they could observe the tactical situation through armored viewports and move shells forward as needed. A 5th crew member operated a sound-powered telephone connected to the ship's combat information center, allowing coordination with radar operators and other weapons systems. The weapon's most significant limitation lay in its range and the requirement for clear lines of sight to engage targets effectively. Unlike the massive 8-inch guns on heavy cruisers that could engage targets beyond the horizon, the 5-inch gun was limited to targets within visual range or detected by the ship's fire control radar. This restriction meant that Japanese aircraft attacking from high altitude or concealed by clouds could press their attacks without facing proximity-fused fire until they descended into the engagement envelope where the fuses would be most effective. Lieutenant Cochrane had positioned his gun crew to cover approaches from the northwest, where intelligence predicted Japanese aircraft would appear based on their known base locations on New Georgia. While other gun mounts covered different sectors of the sky, Cochrane's mount was assigned primary responsibility for engaging the initial wave of attackers, making his crew the most likely to fire the first proximity-fused shells in actual combat against enemy aircraft. As the radar reports indicated Japanese bombers approaching at 18,000 feet, Ralston loaded the first proximity-fused shell into the breech, his hands steady despite the knowledge that he was about to participate in a historic moment that would either validate months of secret development work or expose fatal flaws in a weapon system that had consumed millions of dollars and countless hours of scientific research. The weapon that had been designed in university laboratories and manufactured in factories scattered across the United States was about to face its first test against an enemy that had no idea it existed. At 0800 hours, the 8 Valdive bombers appeared as dark specks against the morning sky, their fixed landing gear making them instantly recognizable to experienced observers. Lieutenant Commander Akira Takayanagi led the formation, confident that his pilots would execute the coordinated attack that had proven successful in previous raids against American shipping. The Vals had launched from Munda Airfield 90 minutes earlier, climbing to attack altitude while crossing the waters of New Georgia Sound. Each aircraft carried a single 550-pound bomb mounted on a swing arm beneath the fuselage, positioned to clear the propeller arc when released during the near-vertical dive that gave these aircraft their fearsome reputation. Takayanagi had briefed his pilots on the target cruiser formation, emphasizing the importance of achieving surprise and pressing home their attacks despite anti-aircraft fire. Japanese dive bomber tactics had evolved through years of combat experience over China and the Pacific. The standard attack profile called for approach at medium altitude, approximately 15,000 to 18,000 feet, where American radar would detect the formation, but fighters would have difficulty intercepting before the dive began. Upon reaching the attack point, pilots would roll inverted, pull through to establish a 70-degree dive angle, and accelerate toward their targets, while making small corrections to place the aiming point directly over the target ship. The dive would continue until reaching an altitude of 1,000 to 1,500 feet, where the pilot would release his bomb and pull up sharply, subjecting himself and his aircraft to forces that could reach 6 Gs or more. During the dive, which typically lasted between 20 and 30 seconds, the bomber would accelerate from approximately 220 miles per hour to more than 350 miles per hour, making it a difficult target for anti-aircraft gunners using conventional timed fuses. Lieutenant Cochrane watched the formation approach through his binoculars, counting aircraft and estimating their altitude and heading. The valves were flying in a loose V formation, with Takayanagi's aircraft at the point and 3 pairs of bombers trailing behind at intervals of approximately 200 yards. The formation had covered nearly half the distance from their detection point to the American cruiser group when Cochrane gave the order to his fire control team to begin tracking the lead aircraft. The lead valves pushed over into their dives at 0812, their engines howling as gravity added to the thrust of their propellers. From the deck of Helena, sailors could see the distinctive fixed landing gear and the single bomb hanging beneath each fuselage as the Japanese aircraft accelerated toward their targets. Other American ships opened fire with their standard timed fuse ammunition, filling the sky with black bursts that blossomed at predetermined altitudes, creating a defensive barrage that the diving valves had to penetrate. Anti-aircraft tracers drew red and white lines through the morning air as dozens of 20mm and 40mm guns joined the defense. But the diving bombers maintained their attack profiles despite the intense fire. At 0815, the first bombs were released, their fins deploying to stabilize their trajectories as they fell toward the cruiser formation below. The attack lasted approximately 3 minutes, with bombs falling throughout the formation and creating towering columns of water where they struck the sea. One bomb hit the heavy cruiser Chicago on her port side, penetrating her hull and detonating inside a machinery space, while 2 others were near misses that caused minor damage through blast effect and fragmentation. The Val bombers pulled out of their dives between 1,000 and 1,500 feet altitude, their pilots breathing heavily from the physical stress of the maneuver and the tension of pressing through anti-aircraft fire that had seemed impenetrable from cockpit level. Takayanagi led his surviving aircraft in a climbing turn to the northwest, gaining altitude as quickly as possible to escape the American fighter combat air patrol that would certainly be vectored toward them within minutes. His pilots were checking their aircraft for battle damage and beginning to relax as they cleared the immediate danger zone, confident they had successfully completed another mission against American shipping. The Vals had climbed to approximately 4,000 feet and were 5 miles northwest of the cruiser formation when Lieutenant Cochrane made his final range calculations and gave Seaman Ralston the order to fire. The first proximity-fused shell left Helena's 5-inch gun at 0817 with a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second, its miniature radio transmitter activating milliseconds after clearing the barrel and beginning to broadcast radio waves in all directions. The shell climbed through the morning sky on a trajectory that would carry it slightly ahead of the lead Val bomber, following a path calculated to bring it within lethal range if Takayanagi maintained his current heading and speed. Inside the shell's nose cone, the tiny vacuum tubes began warming up, their circuits designed to measure the frequency of reflected radio waves and compare them to the transmitted frequency. The Doppler effect caused by the shell's closure rate with the target would increase the frequency of reflected signals, and when that frequency shift reached a predetermined value, indicating a range of approximately 70 feet, the detonation circuit would fire. At 2 seconds after firing, when the shell was approximately 1 mile from Helena's gun mount, the proximity fuse detected a strong reflection from metal surfaces ahead. The aluminum airframe of Takayanagi's Val bomber was an excellent radar reflector, bouncing back a clear signal that the fuse's receiver could detect and measure. The frequency shift calculation took only microseconds, and when the circuit determined that range had decreased to within the detonation threshold, it triggered a small explosive charge in the base of the fuse that initiated the main warhead. The shell exploded 72 feet from Takayanagi's aircraft, creating a sphere of expanding shrapnel that traveled outward at thousands of feet per second. The Val's right wing disintegrated under the impact of dozens of steel fragments, severing control cables and rupturing fuel lines. Takayanagi felt his aircraft lurch violently to the right as the wings separated from the fuselage, sending the bomber into an uncontrollable spin that no amount of pilot input could correct. The aircraft fell 4,000 feet in approximately 8 seconds before striking the water, carrying Takayanagi and his rear gunner to their deaths in a mission they had believed would end in their safe return to Munda. Seaman Ralston already had the second proximity fused shell loaded, slamming it into the breech as the spent powder case clattered onto the deck below the gun mount. The automatic's rammer cycled smoothly, allowing Cochrane to adjust his aim toward another Val that was climbing desperately, its pilot having witnessed the inexplicable destruction of his formation leader. The second round fired 8 seconds after the first, its proximity fuse functioning exactly as designed and detonating 55 feet from the target aircraft. This Val survived the initial blast but suffered critical damage to its engine and control surfaces. The pilot attempted to maintain control while turning toward the nearest Japanese-held island, but his aircraft was losing altitude steadily and leaving a trail of black smoke. The bomber crashed into the sea approximately 12 miles northwest of Helena, becoming the second confirmed kill credited to proximity-fused ammunition in naval combat. The remaining Val bombers scattered, their pilots abandoning formation, discipline in their confusion and fear at facing a weapon they could not understand or evade. American fighters from Henderson Field arrived minutes later and claimed 3 additional Vals, while the final 2 bombers escaped by flying at wave-top altitude where American radar could not track them effectively, and proximity fuses would have been useless against the clutter of sea return. The entire engagement from first shot to last kill had lasted less than 6 minutes, but in that brief period, the nature of anti-aircraft warfare had changed forever. When radar operators confirmed that the last Japanese aircraft had departed the area, Cochrane made his official report to Helena's captain, documenting the first successful use of proximity fuses in naval combat and confirming that the weapon performed as advertised under actual battle conditions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The silence that followed the brief engagement was profound. By 0900 hours on January 5, 1943, the waters around Guadalcanal had returned to their normal state of tense watchfulness. Helena's crew secured from general quarters and began the process of assessing damage from near-miss bombs and preparing for whatever action the rest of the day might bring. Lieutenant Cochrane filed his after-action report in the war wardroom, carefully documenting the performance of the proximity-fused ammunition and noting every detail that might prove useful for future engagements. The immediate tactical success was obvious. 2 confirmed kills from approximately 8 rounds fired represented an effectiveness improvement of more than 100 times compared to standard timed fuse ammunition, where conventional shells required an average of more than 1,000 rounds to down a single enemy aircraft. The proximity fuse had achieved a 2 for 8 success rate. The disparity was so stark that Cochrane initially questioned his own observations, wondering if some factor other than the proximity fuses had contributed to the Japanese bombers' destruction. But Reconnaissance reports and witness statements from other ships in the formation confirmed what Cochrane had seen through his binoculars. Both Val bombers had exploded in mid-air without being struck by visible anti-aircraft fire, and both destructions had occurred immediately after Helena's guns fired. The only possible explanation was that the proximity fuses had functioned exactly as their designers had promised. For the Helena's crew, the victory provided psychological benefits that extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. Sailors who had spent months watching Japanese aircraft press home their attacks despite intense defensive fire now knew that American technology could stop even the most determined enemy assault. The knowledge that their ship possessed a weapon capable of reliably shooting down attacking aircraft provided confidence that would prove essential in the months of hard fighting ahead. Medical personnel treating the wounded from the bomb damage to Chicago reported that morale among the cruiser crews remained high despite the casualties. Admiral Halsey received the preliminary reports at his headquarters on Noumea within hours of the engagement. The news that proximity fuses had achieved their first combat success came at a critical moment in the Solomon Islands campaign, when Japanese air power continued to threaten Allied naval operations and shipping in the region. Halsey immediately requested additional supplies of proximity-fused ammunition for his task force, recognizing that widespread deployment of the new fuses could fundamentally alter the tactical situation in the South Pacific. Production of proximity-fused ammunition increased dramatically throughout the first months of 1943 as manufacturers refined their processes and Navy ordnance officers gained confidence in the weapon's reliability. The Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati, Ohio, which had produced the fuses used in Helena's engagement, expanded its manufacturing capacity specifically to meet demand from Pacific Fleet commanders who had heard about the successful combat debut. By March 1943, American naval forces in the Pacific possessed more than 50,000 proximity-fused shells distributed among cruisers and destroyers from New Guinea to the Aleutian Islands. Training programs for gunnery officers emphasized the importance of proximity fuses in defensive operations, with new personnel spending additional hours learning optimal engagement techniques and fire control procedures that could maximize the weapon's devastating effectiveness. Senior gunnery officers who had witnessed the January 5th engagement became instructors at naval schools, passing on hard-won knowledge about target selection and firing discipline that could mean the difference between successful defense and catastrophic losses. The tactical revolution, represented by proximity-fused ammunition, extended far beyond its immediate battlefield applications. Navy ordnance specialists began designing similar fuses for other weapon systems, creating a family of defensive weapons specifically intended to counter Japanese air attacks. The Mark 32 fuse that Cochrane had used aboard Helena was followed by improved models that reduced the size of the electronic package and improved reliability under extreme conditions. The success of naval proximity fuses influenced weapons development programs throughout the war years, leading to ground-based versions that would prove devastating against German V-1 flying bombs attacking London in 1944. Japanese military leaders gradually recognized that American anti-aircraft fire had become significantly more effective during the first half of 1943, though they never discovered the existence of proximity fuses until after the war ended. Intelligence reports from surviving pilots described anti-aircraft fire that seemed to explode precisely at aircraft altitude, regardless of evasive maneuvers. But Japanese technical experts dismissed these accounts as exaggerations born from combat stress. The possibility that American ordnance engineers had developed a revolutionary new fuse seemed too technologically advanced to be credible, and Japanese scientists had concluded that proximity fuses were impossible to manufacture because of the extreme acceleration forces experienced during gunfiring. Lieutenant Commander Parsons, who had overseen the proximity fuse development program from its inception, wrote a confidential memo to Navy leadership in February 1943, summarizing the lessons learned from the Helena engagement. His analysis showed that proximity fuses were most effective when employed according to specific doctrinal guidelines that maximize their advantages while minimizing limitations. The fuses required clear radar tracking of targets and worked best against aircraft flying predictable courses at medium to high altitudes. They were less effective against aircraft flying at wave-top level where sea return cluttered radar pictures, and they could not be used over land where unexploded shells might be recovered by enemy forces and reverse engineered. The security concerns were legitimate and influenced how proximity fuses were deployed throughout the war. Until late 1944, proximity-fused ammunition was used exclusively over water, where unexploded shells would sink to the ocean floor beyond enemy recovery. This restriction prevented one of the weapon's most valuable applications, anti-infantry artillery fire that could create devastating airbursts over advancing troops. But Navy leadership considered the security risk too great to allow land-based use until Allied forces had advanced deep into enemy territory. The technical specifications of the Mark 32 proximity fuse revealed engineering achievements that seemed almost impossible given the constraints under which designers had worked. Each fuse measured approximately 4 inches in height and weighed just over 2 pounds, fitting snugly into the nose cone of a 5-inch shell with minimal modification to the standard ammunition design. Inside that compact package, engineers had managed to install 4 miniature vacuum tubes, a battery that activated upon firing, a radio transmitter operating at approximately 180 megahertz, a receiver tuned to detect reflected signals, and a detonation circuit that could function reliably after experiencing acceleration forces of more than 20,000 Gs. The vacuum tubes were the technological breakthrough that made everything else possible. Standard commercial vacuum tubes, available in 1940, would shatter instantly under the forces generated during gunfiring, their glass envelopes cracking and their internal elements breaking loose from their moorings. Sylvania Electric Products developed a ruggedized tube specifically for proximity fuse applications, with reinforced glass construction and internal elements that could withstand shock loads far exceeding anything previously attempted in commercial or military electronics. These tubes were manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, with each unit tested extensively before being approved for installation in fuses destined for combat use. The battery system represented another engineering challenge that required innovative solutions. A proximity fuse needed to remain inactive during storage and handling, then activate instantly when fired, providing stable electrical power for the 15 to 20 seconds required for a shell to reach its target and detonate. The solution involved a battery design that used the massive setback forces during gunfiring to break small glass ampoules containing electrolyte, which would then mix with battery plates to generate electricity. This setback battery concept ensured that fuses remained safe during peacetime handling while activating reliably under combat conditions. Dr. Tuve's team at Johns Hopkins had tested thousands of prototype fuses during development, subjecting them to acceleration forces, temperature extremes, humidity, vibration, and every other stress factor that might be encountered during manufacture, shipping, storage, and combat use. The failure rate in early testing had been catastrophically high, with more than half of all prototype fuses failing to function properly when subjected to simulated gunfiring. But systematic improvements to design and manufacturing processes gradually brought reliability up to acceptable levels. By the time Helena received her first proximity-fused ammunition in October 1942, the failure rate had dropped below 5%, a remarkable achievement given the complexity of the technology involved. The radio frequency selection process had required careful analysis of electromagnetic interference patterns and atmospheric propagation characteristics. The chosen frequency of 180 megahertz represented a compromise between several competing requirements. Lower frequencies would have required larger antennas that wouldn't fit inside shell nose cones, while higher frequencies would have suffered from excessive atmospheric attenuation. The selected frequency provided reliable target detection at ranges up to several hundred feet, while minimizing interference from friendly transmitters operating nearby. Seaman Ralston, who had loaded the historic first shots aboard Helena, later described the psychological impact of working with ammunition that looked identical to standard shells, but contained technology that seemed almost magical. The proximity fuses required no special handling procedures beyond normal ammunition safety protocols, and gunners had no way to tell by looking at a shell whether it contained a proximity fuse or a standard timed fuse. The only external difference was a small letter V stamped on the base of proximity-fused shells, indicating their classification as VT ammunition in official documentation. Throughout the spring and summer of 1943, proximity-fused ammunition proved its worth in engagement after engagement across the Pacific Theater. During the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March, American and Australian aircraft decimated a Japanese convoy attempting to reinforce Lae in New Guinea. But it was naval anti-aircraft fire, using proximity fuses, that protected the Allied task force from Japanese air counterattacks. In July, during the invasion of Sicily, proximity fuses, aboard American cruisers and destroyers, created such effective defensive barriers that German and Italian aircraft achieved minimal success despite launching hundreds of sorties against the invasion fleet. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who commanded a destroyer squadron in the Solomon Islands campaign during 1942 and 43, wrote after the war about the transformation that proximity fuses brought to naval air defense. Before their introduction, he recalled, defending against Japanese air attacks at night had been almost hopeless, with mechanical time fuses bringing down aircraft only by accident. The proximity fuse changed everything, allowing American ships to maintain aggressive patrol stations even when intelligence indicated heavy Japanese air activity in the area. The statistical improvement was dramatic and undeniable. By the end of 1943, analysis of combat action reports showed that proximity-fused ammunition required an average of approximately 120 rounds to down an enemy aircraft, compared to the 1,200 rounds required by conventional timed fuses. The tenfold improvement in effectiveness meant that American ships could engage more targets with their available ammunition, sustain defensive fire for longer periods, and achieve higher kill rates against attacking formations. Japanese naval aviation suffered increasingly heavy losses as proximity fuses became standard equipment on American warships throughout the Pacific. Veteran pilots who had survived the early campaigns began to notice that American anti-aircraft fire had become significantly more accurate and deadly, with shells seeming to explode at exactly the right altitude and position to inflict maximum damage. Japanese intelligence officers interviewed survivors extensively, trying to determine what had changed in American defensive tactics, but the pilots could provide no useful information beyond describing the increased effectiveness they had witnessed firsthand. Some Japanese airmen developed superstitious beliefs about American anti-aircraft fire, convinced that some form of invisible guidance system directed shells toward their aircraft. These beliefs weren't entirely wrong, though the guidance came from reflected radio waves rather than any supernatural force. The psychological impact of facing an enemy weapon that seemed to possess almost supernatural accuracy contributed to declining morale among Japanese naval aviators, who found themselves facing not only American fighters and ship-based anti-aircraft guns, but also a defensive system that could track and destroy them, regardless of their evasive maneuvers. The industrial achievement represented by proximity fuse production was as impressive as the technology itself. By mid-1944, American factories were producing more than 40,000 proximity fuses daily, an output rate that required massive coordination among component manufacturers, assembly plants, and quality control inspectors. Crosley Corporation remained the primary contractor for Mark 32 fuses, but additional manufacturers, including RCA, General Electric, and Sylvania, were brought into the program to meet ever-increasing demand from both naval and ground forces. The quality control procedures were extraordinarily stringent. Every proximity fuse produced had to pass multiple electrical tests, verifying that all circuits functioned within specified parameters. Random samples from each production batch were subjected to live fire testing at proving grounds, where they were loaded into shells fired from guns and evaluated to ensure they detonated at the correct range when presented with simulated targets. Fuses that failed any stage of testing were disassembled and analyzed to identify manufacturing defects, and corrective actions were implemented immediately to prevent similar failures in future production. The cost per fuse was significant, but considered worthwhile given the dramatic improvement in effectiveness. Each Mark 32 fuse cost approximately $18 to manufacture in 1943, equivalent to approximately $300 in modern currency. When combined with the shell, powder charge, and shipping costs, a single proximity-fused round cost the Navy approximately $35. This was roughly 10 times the cost of a conventional timed fuse round. But the tenfold improvement in effectiveness meant that proximity fuses actually reduced the total cost of achieving a kill against enemy aircraft. Lieutenant Cochrane remained with Helena throughout 1943 and into early 1944, participating in numerous engagements where proximity fuses proved their worth repeatedly. The cruiser survived several major battles, including the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942 and numerous air attacks during operations in the Central Solomons. Cochrane's gun crew became one of the most proficient in the Pacific Fleet, credited with downing multiple enemy aircraft using proximity-fused ammunition. The human cost of proximity-fused development was never forgotten by those who worked on the program. Several test pilots and ordnance technicians died during development, when experimental fuses malfunctioned or when testing procedures went wrong. Factory workers suffered injuries from handling high explosives and toxic chemicals used in battery manufacture. The success of the weapon came at a price paid by individuals whose names never appeared in history books, but whose contributions were essential to Allied victory in the Pacific. Japanese attempts to develop their own proximity fuses began after intelligence reports in mid-1943 suggested that American anti-aircraft effectiveness had improved dramatically. Japanese scientists and engineers explored various approaches, including optical fuses that would detect light reflected from aircraft, acoustic fuses triggered by engine noise, and electrostatic fuses that sensed the electrical field disturbance caused by approaching aircraft. More than 30 different designs were developed or researched for anti-aircraft use, but none reached operational status before the war ended. The technical challenges that Japanese engineers faced were the same ones that American scientists had overcome years earlier, but Japan lacked the industrial capacity and specialized manufacturing expertise required to mass-produce miniaturized electronics under wartime conditions. The vacuum tube manufacturing capability that made American proximity fuses possible simply didn't exist in Japan, where electronics production focused on larger radio sets and radar equipment that used standard commercial-grade tubes. The precision required to manufacture ruggedized tubes capable of surviving gun firing was beyond Japanese industrial capabilities in the 1940s. By late 1944, proximity fuses had become so common in American arsenals that restrictions on their use over land were gradually lifted. The first land-based combat use came in June 1944 when British anti-aircraft batteries defending London against German V-1 flying bombs received proximity-fused ammunition. The results were spectacular. During the first month of use, proximity fuses increased the destruction rate of V-1s from approximately 24% to nearly 80%, effectively ending the threat to London from Hitler's revenge weapons. General George Patton encountered proximity fuses during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when his Third Army received 200,000 proximity-fused artillery shells for use against German ground forces. Patton wrote enthusiastically about the new ammunition, describing how a single artillery battery using proximity fuses could devastate enemy forces caught in the open. The shells would detonate at a predetermined height above ground, typically between 20 and 30 feet, creating air bursts that showered troops with shrapnel across areas hundreds of feet wide. Trenches and foxholes provided no protection against this type of fire, and German soldiers learned to fear American artillery fire in ways they had never experienced before. The German army captured some proximity-fused shells during the Battle of the Bulge and attempted to reverse engineer the technology, but German scientists who examined the captured fuses concluded they were impossible to manufacture using available German industrial techniques. The miniaturization and precision required for the electronic components was beyond German capabilities in late 1944, and even if the Germans had possessed the manufacturing expertise, the materials required for production were unavailable due to Allied strategic bombing of German industry. Dr. Tuve received numerous awards for his work on the proximity fuse, including the Presidential Medal for Merit and the King's Medal for Service in the cause of freedom from the British government. But Tuve always insisted that credit belonged to the entire Section T team and the thousands of workers in factories across America who had transformed laboratory prototypes into weapons that could be mass-produced and deployed globally. The proximity fuse represented industrial democracy at its finest, combining scientific brilliance, engineering expertise, manufacturing capability, and tactical innovation into a weapon system that helped win the war. The legacy of the proximity fuse extended far beyond World War II. The basic principles developed by Tuve's team influenced every guided weapon system developed during the Cold War and beyond. Modern air-to-air missiles, surface-to-air missiles, and anti-ship weapons all use proximity fuses derived from the original Mark 32 design. The miniaturization techniques pioneered for proximity fuse manufacture contributed to the development of transistors and integrated circuits that made modern electronics possible. Technologies we take for granted today, from smartphones to GPS systems, trace their lineage back to innovations first developed to make a 5-inch artillery shell detonate near enemy aircraft. Lieutenant Cochrane survived the war and returned to civilian life in Ohio, where he worked as an electrical engineer for a telecommunications company. He never spoke publicly about his role in firing the first proximity fuse shots in naval combat, honoring the classification that kept proximity fuse technology secret until 1946. When the technology was finally declassified, Cochrane gave occasional interviews to naval historians, but he always emphasized that he had simply followed his training and that credit belonged to the scientists and engineers who had created the weapon. Seaman Ralston completed his naval service in 1945, having participated in numerous actions where proximity fuses proved decisive. His loading speed and reliability under fire earned commendations from 3 different commanding officers, though Ralston himself considered his role unremarkable compared to the sailors who fought in damage control parties or manned exposed gun positions during kamikaze attacks. He used the GI Bill to attend engineering school in Michigan, becoming a mechanical engineer who occasionally mentioned his naval service but never described the specific nature of the ammunition he had loaded during the war. Helena survived multiple engagements through 1943 before being sunk by Japanese torpedoes during the Battle of Kula Gulf on July 6, 1943. The cruiser went down in less than 20 minutes after being struck by 3 torpedoes from Japanese destroyers, taking 168 sailors with her. Among the survivors was Lieutenant Cochrane, who spent 6 hours in the water before being rescued by American destroyers. His experience reinforced his belief that the proximity fuse, while revolutionary, was only one tool in the complex business of naval warfare, and that ultimately victory depended on the courage and skill of the sailors who manned American ships. The tactical lessons learned from proximity fuse employment influenced American military doctrine throughout the Cold War period. Anti-aircraft gunnery schools taught new generations of sailors and soldiers how to employ proximity-fused ammunition effectively, emphasizing fire discipline and target selection that maximized the probability of kills while conserving ammunition. The 70-foot detonation radius that made proximity fuses so effective also meant that friendly aircraft needed to maintain safe distances from ships using proximity-fused ammunition, a coordination requirement that led to improved air defense identification procedures still used today. Japanese military historians writing after the war, acknowledged that proximity fuses contributed significantly to the defeat of Japanese naval aviation in the Pacific. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, who survived the war and wrote extensively about Japanese military failures, identified the introduction of proximity fuses as a turning point that forced fundamental changes in attack tactics. Japanese aviators who had pressed home their attacks despite heavy anti-aircraft fire in 1942 and early 1943 became increasingly cautious as proximity fuses made such tactics suicidal. This caution reduced the effectiveness of Japanese air attacks, allowing American naval forces to operate with greater freedom throughout the Pacific. Admiral Halsey, who had requested the first combat deployment of proximity fuses to his task force in the Solomon Islands, wrote after the war that the weapon ranked among the most important technological developments of the Pacific campaign. In his memoirs, Halsey compared the proximity fuse's impact to that of radar and code breaking, technologies that provided American forces with decisive advantages that Japanese counterparts could neither match nor effectively counter. The psychological effect on American sailors was as important as the tactical effectiveness, since crew members who knew their ships possessed weapons capable of reliably defeating air attacks were more willing to maintain aggressive patrol stations in waters where Japanese air power remained a constant threat. The industrial mobilization required to produce millions of proximity fuses represented one of the great logistical achievements of World War II. By war's end, American factories had produced more than 22 million proximity fuses of all types, from the original Mark 32 naval fuses to later models designed for Army artillery, mortar rounds, and even rockets. This production required coordination among more than 100 companies, thousands of subcontractors, and hundreds of thousands of workers who manufactured components, assembled fuses, and conducted quality control testing. The security requirements were extraordinary, with entire factory floors cleared of workers not possessing appropriate clearances, and armed guards patrolling facilities where proximity fuses were being manufactured. The scientific achievement represented by the proximity fuse earned recognition from the highest levels of Allied leadership. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill authorized a special airlift of proximity fuses from America to England when British anti-aircraft defenses needed them urgently to counter V-1 attacks in 1944. Churchill later wrote that the proximity fuse was one of the three most important Allied technological developments of the war, ranking alongside radar and the atomic bomb in strategic significance. American President Franklin Roosevelt never publicly commented on proximity fuses due to security classifications, but he received regular briefings on their effectiveness and personally approved the massive industrial investment required for their production. Dr. Merle Tuve continued his work in physics and electronics after the war, becoming director of the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism at the Carnegie Institution and contributing to numerous scientific advances in fields ranging from radar to nuclear physics. But Tuve always considered the proximity fuse his most important contribution, not because of its technical sophistication, but because of its impact on saving Allied lives. Every American sailor who survived a Japanese air attack because proximity fuses shot down attacking aircraft represented a life saved by scientific innovation, and Tuve believed that practical applications of science to solve real-world problems justified the abstract research that made such applications possible. The transformation of naval warfare that began with Lieutenant Cochrane's first shots on January 5, 1943, continued throughout the remainder of the Pacific War and into the post-war period. By 1945, proximity fuses had become so ubiquitous in American arsenals that their revolutionary nature was easy to overlook. Young sailors joining the fleet assumed that proximity-fused ammunition had always existed, unaware that just 2 years earlier, the same weapons had been impossible dreams in the minds of scientists struggling with seemingly insurmountable technical challenges. The final irony of the proximity fuse story was that the weapon which had seemed impossible to manufacture in 1940 had become so common by 1945 that surplus fuses were being scrapped or sold as surplus at a war's end. The technological revolution that had required years of development and billions of dollars in investment had become routine in less than 3 years, a testament to American industrial capability and the adaptability of military forces facing determined enemies. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.